Well, this video was a while in the making. Today we're talking about Season 6 Conquest. More specifically, we're talking about the current meta a little bit, as well as the development of one particular role throughout the season. And that role is jungle, because I wanted to look back at all the roles throughout the year to see what has changed for them, but I kind of realized that for most roles, not really all too much has changed since the beginning of the year. There was a minor change to duo that directly affected jungle as well, and other than that, all major changes revolving around the game design were focused on jungle. And based on that, even the current meta seems to hinge a lot on the development of the jungle overall. And I wanted to look a little bit more into that, and I had to do quite a bit of research and look back through a lot of patch notes to get this all together. I will preface this by saying that I personally think that Smite currently has one of its worst metas in a long time. I think balance-wise we are in a very good place when it comes to the gods, but I think the meta on the map itself is just absolutely obnoxious for almost everyone involved. If you've been playing for a while, you may remember that around Season 3, Season 4, we had these metas where we would frequently have gods sharing jungle camps, usually the mid laner and the jungler, and the support also spending a lot of time around that area, and you're often having these cluster fights of 3 people around middle, and that's something that came back relatively frequently, and we're in one of those metas again, where really middle is basically an arena that starts around the speed buff at the start of the game and then moves towards the center of the map, and on the sides we have 2 solo lanes. And I think this meta is boring, I think this meta is unfun, I think this meta is predictable, but you can't prevent it, and I think this meta is the fault of the choices that Hi-Rez has made this season. This video is not going to be a rant, but I will say that for me this meta has led to me actually not enjoying jungle at all, and to some degree also not enjoying Conquest as much as I used to. So I'm actually playing Joust more than I'm playing Conquest at the moment, because I think it's just not fun to play. Now, to understand how it came to this, we have to turn back time a little bit more than just to the start of the season. We have to briefly go to the start of Season 5. Here we had the new Conquest map being introduced, which was 20% wider, meaning a little bit more travel time between the lanes, and jungle camps on this map would respawn faster, but give less golden XP in return, generally being designed towards being more soloable by the jungler as opposed to being shared. And to further enhance that, the values for XP sharing were also decreased. Additionally, both jungle camps as well as lane minions would receive some sort of scaling to the XP and level over time, so that the early game would be slowed down a fair bit, while the late game would still provide similar benefits. That towards the end of the year resulted in a particular meta that especially dual laners, especially hunters, were complaining a lot about, and I would say rightfully so. Because what happened was that at least on higher levels of play, you would see junglers doing very quick pathing towards duo lane, hitting level 2 before the duo lane even can, and then having an early game gank, and basically whichever one got ganked first lost that lane, because you had a 3v2 for a few seconds with somebody being a level above you that's designed to be good at ganking, and yeah, getting a kill out of that isn't that hard. This particular circumstance led to a lot of snowball on the winning side, in particular for the ADC and for the jungler. That was not a balanced meta. I would absolutely say that at that point there needed to be something that needed to be changed. At the same time, I would argue that at that point junglers weren't inherently completely OP. They were a little bit too strong, they were towards the stronger side because of these early kills that they could get this way. But it wasn't like the entire game was purely dominated by the jungler afterwards. In other words, a reasonable level of nerfs was needed for junglers without entirely breaking the role or making it utterly useless. And that was attempted with the start of Season 6. Now I will split this a little bit. I will first talk about the changes that were done to junglers directly or that affect junglers in other ways, and then the changes that were done to items. I will not talk about guard changes here, because those just affect one particular guard and not a role as a whole. So the first change was done in patch 6.1, with the jungle camps having their stats changed. Now this is a topic that I can go relatively in depth on, and I will, but not at this part of the video, but at the very end, for those of you who actually want to see that, because this is a little bit more numbers heavy and doesn't really provide that much new information, but rather just gives you a better overview. So if you want to see that, stay tuned until the end. Otherwise, I'll let you know when it's time to turn off. Along with those camps, the Gold Fury was also changed, so it's harder to solo in early game. This is a nerf to junglers, but different from the jungle camp changes, I don't think it affected all too many junglers, because most junglers wouldn't solo Gold Fury on the regular early on, it's mostly just for Arachne. At the same time, warriors also got a blanket buff. They all got increased base HP and HP per level, which is something that definitely counteracts assassins to some degree as well. Totem of Ku was introduced, which is in a sense an item that helps junglers. It wasn't primarily focused on by junglers, rather by the solo laner, but the speed boost can help junglers. The problem is it's a very one-sided benefit. If your team gets that buff, then you can utilize it. If your team doesn't, then you can't. And overall, I feel like it's not exactly crazy. It's something you pick up on the way when you can, but it doesn't feel like it's super impactful to me personally. The Primal Fury was also introduced, which gives you a little bit of a bonus damage effect to camps, jungle camps as well, and that was later increased. But I don't really see that as a major buff because it can't be controlled at all with the spawns of the Gold Fury, so really getting benefit out of that is very limited, and if it happens in later stages of the game. Additionally, the Brute spawn rate was increased ever so slightly in the lanes, which is basically something that helps junglers a little bit because Brutes take a little bit longer to kill, but it was a very, very minor change. Let's hear some of Hyra's justifications. Regarding the jungle camp changes, with Season 5 came a large change to the jungle layout, camps, and the overall speed at which those could be cleared. That is accurate. Before they had a lot more health, but the jungle was also generally different. Through Season 5 we saw players killing these camps a bit too quickly, even without items like Assassin's Blessing to empower their clear speed. Jungle camps will become tankier as the game progresses, better keeping up with players' power curves. I will say that looking back, this statement surprises me. I didn't find the clear overly extreme in Season 5, and the intent of the changes in Season 5 was to speed up the clear, and I also don't see an issue with assassins being good enough without Assassin's Blessing and trying alternative playstyles, much like many other ults are able to as well, looking at mid especially here. Or looking at Transcendence Hunters for that matter. I don't know why assassins, in particular junglers, are so forced into their blessings more than others are. So the goal was to slow down the clearing speed, which should, in my opinion, also have an effect on early invades. Next one is the patch 6.2. Here the speed buff got a nerf, with the base movement speed being decreased from 10% to 5%. And this speed once upon a time used to be 20%. Then it was 15, and it was 10, and now it was 5%. And you would get the bonus movement speed for killing the camps. That was temporary and everything, but definitely not the same that the buff used to be. The reasoning here was as follows. Movement speed is one of the strongest stats in the game, especially when guards get a critical mass of movement speed. Speed buff should provide a nice supplement to a guard's movement, but currently it allows a player to rotate very quickly, yes that's the point, farm efficiently, yes that's the point, and chase targets more effectively by itself, yes that's also the point. The level of speed provided is problematic early on in a match. Is it though? We are decreasing the movement speed provided by 5% to put the brakes on its overall power. Junglers will be able to recoup some of this loss later on in the game, when it's healthier to have that level of speed through the adjustment to Assassin's Blessing. Even back then, shortly after this happened, some pro player junglers adapting and Captain Twig commented about how they really don't value speed buff anymore at this point. And you see the continuation of this nowadays with some junglers not even starting at speed buff anymore. Along with that, Assassin's Blessing also was nerfed. The power of an evolved Assassin's Blessing compared to an unevolved Assassin's Blessing is large, more so than other blessings. This is not a surprise because over and over I've said this, Assassin's Blessing is designed in a way where it is just very, very weak in its original form, whereas all other blessings are already relatively good items in their first form. Assassin's Blessing is just designed for jungle clear, so of course adding any stats to that makes the item significantly better. If you start from nothing, then just adding a little bit makes it much better than before, because before there was nothing. This will forever remain one of the most absurd reasonings that I've read from Hyras. They said we want to bring it more in line with the reward for other blessings, which is basically the opposite of what they did. They changed the evolution bonus from 10 penetration to 5 penetration and 5% movement speed. That means the overall reward for evolving the item hasn't changed at all. It's still the same quantity basically, only that it's changed what you get instead. And 5 penetration can very much be weighed against 5 movement speed. The difference is that things were taken away in other places here. The movement speed buff lost its movement speed and it was put on Assassin's Blessing instead, but then Assassin's Blessing also lost the 5 pen, so 5 pen just completely disappeared in this equation for later stages of the game, an impact that they most definitely feel. Hi-Rez acknowledged the problem of this item in the very description, but then completely neglected to actually address the problem with the item and instead just took stats away from junglers overall. Next, in patch 6.4 in the Darkness Falls patch, Spirit minions were introduced, a minion in dual lane with 50 HP that gives 34 XP, just so that the ADC and the support would hit level 2 with the second wave, meaning they would not longer be invaded by level 2 junglers the same way. And Hi-Rez description specifically emphasized that this was made so they could fight back better against junglers and make more meaningful plays in early game. Now realize this, because of the previous nerfs in the other patches, junglers invading on level 2 in dual lane wasn't even a problem anymore, it wasn't even happening anymore. We still got this change, which I guess in itself was actually a good change, if it wasn't for the other stuff that happened before. So I actually thought when this change came out, okay, they're gonna revert some of the other jungler nerfs because now they are no longer necessary. Hi-Rez didn't do any of that. What they did in that patch though is they also further nerfed the potential for invades by reducing the XP and gold reward for early invades. This is a nerf to junglers, but I think at the same time this is not necessarily a problematic one. I think there should be more of a downside to invading in general, so I am somewhat more okay with this one. But what was the actual long-term result of these changes? Hunters like their XP, and they don't like sharing their XP. And with that little spirit guy, they got a little bit more XP even. And they did not want to share any of that with the support if they didn't have to. And that is something that transitioned over into pro games who said, okay, we're just gonna get our hunters as ahead as possible, leave them on their own, let them play their mages. These shifts were all kind of resulting from that as well, where you would have very odd compositions between duo and mid, typically swapping out the hunter and the mage between the roles. And yeah, the support wandered off to do different things. We had a period where the support actually started in solo lane and would secure the totem early on, and now we've strayed further from that, and most of the supports that play aggressive will try to invade early on or start around mid. Is depending on the situation really, but you see a very strong shift away from dual lane in either case. And ironically, this is not even the first role that we see trying to invade the speed buff early on, because we already had a period of the solo laners trying that beforehand. And why is that? Because Assassin's Blessing is just a terrible item compared to every other starter item, like I mentioned before. If you have Warrior's Blessing early on, if you have Guardian's Blessing, and then you have a little bit more of an early game focused character as well, then there's not much fighting back against you really. Sure, sometimes you can just delay things and sometimes the enemy team can coordinate completely against that, but that requires a lot of commitment on their side, and then you kind of have done your job already. And as we discussed the value of speed buff, it's not so much about the buff itself in the first place. No one really needs the speed buff all that much. It's just about denying the early levels into the game, the early gold, the early XP. And the result, honestly, is a bit of a clown fiesta. But Hi-Rez did some jungle item changes, maybe those helped. Well, let's start with 6.1. And Seele had its cost increased, a nerf for junglers. Blackthorn Hammer had its power increased, a buff for junglers, though the item is more of a solo laner than a jungler item at this point. Subsequently, in patch 6.5, the item has its health decreased, and in 6.6 it had its cost increased, so that benefit didn't really last long anyways. Runeforged Hammer had its power increased, but its health decreased, so left it black here, it's kind of a bit of both. The cost, however, was later increased, and the power was, to a minor amount, decreased. Hazen Katana was nerfed in patch 6.5, and then had its cost increased in 6.8 on top of that. There were some other changes to Ninja Taibai and Kinsai that kind of can offset that a little bit, but not really, because Hazen Katana was a lot more core than those items on certain guards. Shift's shield had a change that I would argue is possibly for the better, but didn't really make it much of a meta item either. Transcendence and Hydra's Lament had a buff, but it was a very minor one because it was just an MP5 increase really. Erendite was introduced to the game, which could technically be seen as a bonus for junglers, a beneficial thing. The problem is, 3 other items were introduced, so every single role in the game would have access to one at least, and all of them were better than Erendite initially. In 6.12, Erendite received a power increase, which might make it a little bit better now, so we might actually see it as a useful item at this point, but that's yet to be determined, so we can't say that 100% sure, but it should be happening. In 6.8, Talaria Boots also got a power nerf. 6.9, Stonecutting Sword had its movement speed nerfed. In 6.10, Heartseeker was reworked and buffed, and that was actually a good thing for junglers. And because of that, in 6.11 it already had a nerf with its cost being increased, but the power at least was fixed at this point. And then in 6.11, the Mojo patch, we had a tiny little buff to Assassin's Blessing, increasing its mana restore per target from 20 to 25. No one really cares about that one. But it also got 50 flat extra HP, which still does not allow it to compete with early game items of any sort really, because it still is far behind them and it still doesn't do anything for junglers in the jungle when it comes to boxing, which I find absurd. I think they really should get some sort of power spike while in the jungle. Hyra's main reasoning between a lot of these changes has basically always been that junglers statistically have a high impact on the game, and that still happens even now. And I think that's a weird argument to make, because a jungler is specifically designed to have a high impact on the game. Every laner has a lane opponent, and that's not going to create much disruption. You can either win or lose your lane, but it's not necessarily going to turn the game in earlier stages. Sure, if an ADC snowballs in late game, then that's a completely different story and the ADC will decide the game. But the jungler is the one who is meant to nudge either position in the right direction here, give the ADC a few kills here and there, or maybe support the middle lane a little bit in that regard. And that's literally what he's supposed to do, and if he can't do that effectively, then the jungler is a very pointless role. If he ganks lanes but never kills anyone and therefore doesn't influence the game, then why have a jungler? Why not have 2 duo lanes? And another perspective to look at this from is if we go back to the earlier seasons. Assuming that junglers were too strong in earlier stages of this season, then how utterly broken must junglers have been for years, when they were running around with 20% speed buffs, with a Bumba's Mask that restores more health than it does nowadays, that overall had similar base stats. It already had 50 health and 50 mana. It gave you true damage, which especially helped out in early games against certain targets. And it also had the 25 mana restore already, and it also gave you 4 additional gold, and you could build it along with an item like Bluestone or Death Toll. Reading any of Hyra's statements about the balance changes to junglers, it makes it sound like those times were completely OP for junglers and junglers were dominating everything on the Conquest map. But they weren't. They were strong in certain phases and they were weaker in others, same as every other role. But very few roles have seen these drastic changes over the time span of a year, so one-dimensional, so one-directional. So I really hope for Season 7, where I'm kind of not expecting that we get a new Conquest map yet, but I'm happy to be surprised. Hyra's kind of makes a decision about where they want to take junglers and focus more on an overall balance between all roles than focusing in on one role being changed over and over and over just to accommodate other roles at some point in a very awkward and negative way. Those are the closing words for this part, so if you enjoyed this video, thank you guys very much for watching. Feel free to click the sub button and make the bell, it really helps me out. But if you would like to stick around for some more of the older numbers, I have a few tables that I dug up, basically starting from Season 2 to Season 3, and then Season 5 and Season 6. What we can see here is in Season 2, the whole jungle used to give 1,500 XP roughly and 500 gold. And in Season 3 we had a somewhat similar picture, more 1,400 XP and 600 gold. Whereas laning was around 330 XP and 87 gold per wave. With the jungle being roughly 4 waves at the time, they were pretty even. It was sometimes even favorable for junglers, but at the same time it depended a lot on which jungle you were playing and how good your sustain in the jungle was, which also made different junglers a lot more impactful. By late Season 4, things hadn't changed that much in terms of the stats that you would get. You'd still get roughly 1500 XP again, but the gold had gone up a fair bit to 750 when you include the bonus from Bamba's Mask. The jungle was harder to clear back then because targets had a lot more HP, but at the same time the movement speed from the jungle buff was significantly higher and the map was also smaller, so rotations around the map were much faster and it was more time spent on the camps killing the camps. Due to the map size, there was also a lot of camp sharing going on, and the camps did not scale in gold or XP and did not scale in power but had higher power initially. Between Season 5 and Season 6 you can see quite a few changes to the HP of the camps here. HP 1 being the one that you actually see in game, the one that they have when they have their first level, which they have once they spawn. The other one is just kind of how the scaling for the HP is calculated. And the XP and gold scaled up at this point. However, the starting XP is now significantly lower with 928, while the starting gold remained roughly around the same area as it's always been, starting with 594, roughly 600, and then scaling up with 1.5 gold per level of these camps, per minion of the camp. So while you may clear the jungle faster, you are slower in traveling around between the camps, but the camps also spawn faster. This means more camps in the jungle are up, you have less downtime, you have to go into lanes, which I think is a good change, but at the same time, I think you are very limited as a jungler when it comes to your XP, because not taking a camp at any point and deciding to go for a gank can very easily put you behind, which wasn't always the case to that extent. It seems like these days it's a lot more rewarding to just play as a farm bot and focus on late game entirely, which we also see reflected in many jungle builds that go for items like Transcendence and Heartseeker very early on, just knowing that they're gonna need that in late game. But yeah, this was a bit more of a detailed breakdown for those of you who are interested in that. Again, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all for the next one tomorrow. Hopefully I will actually be able to make it by tomorrow this time. DukeSloth, out.